Hey everyone! Welcome back to the channel. Hope you're all doing well. Now, imagine this: you're a billionaire, living a life full of luxury, power, and control. You think you have it all. And then, a simple waitress serves you lunch, and your world turns upside down. Sounds crazy, right? Well, that's exactly what happened to one man who thought he could mock anyone, only to regret it when he learned who she really was. Today, I'm going to take you through a story of ego, humiliation, and ultimately, redemption. It's a tale of how arrogance can blind you to the truth, and how one woman turned everything around. Are you ready? Let's dive in. The restaurant buzzed with the quiet hum of conversation, the clinking of silverware against fine china, and the occasional burst of laughter from wealthy patrons. The chandeliers above cast a warm golden glow over the elegantly decorated dining hall, where the rich and influential gathered to indulge in their expensive tastes. It was the kind of place where every detail screamed luxury, from the crisp white tablecloths to the servers who moved with precision, catering to the whims of their elite customers. Emma moved swiftly between tables, her black and white uniform neatly pressed, her posture straight, and her hands steady as she carried a tray of drinks. She had been working at this restaurant for over a year now, blending into the background like any other server, unnoticed and unimportant in the eyes of the wealthy clientele. Her long dark hair was tied back into a simple ponytail, and her hazel eyes held a quiet resilience. She spoke only when necessary, responding with polite nods and practiced smiles. But behind that composed exterior, there was something unreadable about her, a quiet strength that few noticed. The large wooden doors of the restaurant swung open, and in walked Richard Carter. He didn't need an introduction, his presence alone demanded attention. Tall, sharply dressed in an expensive navy blue suit, and carrying an air of superiority, he exuded wealth and power. The son of a billionaire real estate tycoon, Richard had grown up in privilege, never knowing what it meant to struggle. He never had to wait for anything in life, money could buy him whatever he wanted, and people bent over backward to please him. As he made his way to his reserved table, a few guests turned to greet him, eager to get into his good graces. Richard gave them brief, dismissive nods before sliding into his seat, checking his expensive watch as if his time was too valuable to be wasted on pleasantries. His two business associates, both equally well-dressed and arrogant, chuckled as they discussed a recent deal. The waiter assigned to their table rushed over, bowing slightly before asking for their orders. Emma, who had just finished serving another table, was called over by the restaurant manager. She quickly approached Richard's table with a tray carrying a bottle of red wine and 3 glasses. Her movements were practiced, professional, and efficient. As she reached their table, she gently tilted the bottle, ready to pour the wine into Richard's glass. Just then, a loud burst of laughter erupted from Richard's friends. The sudden noise startled Emma, and before she could react, the bottle tilted too much, a stream of deep red liquid spilled out, splashing directly onto Richard's pristine designer suit. For a moment, the entire restaurant seemed to freeze. Conversations halted, eyes turned toward the scene unfolding at Richard Carter's table. The silence was deafening. Richard looked down at his ruined suit in disbelief. A deep anger flashed in his cold blue eyes as he slowly raised his gaze to meet Emma's. His jaw clenched, nostrils flared, and for a second, it seemed like he was struggling to process what had just happened. Then, without warning, he pushed back his chair with a loud screech, standing up abruptly. "You idiot," he snapped, his voice cutting through the quiet air like a knife. "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs?" Emma immediately stepped back, her hands clutching the now half-empty bottle of wine, her face unreadable. She opened her mouth to apologize, but Richard didn't let her. "This is why people like you will never be more than low-class workers," he spat, brushing at the stain furiously. "You can't even do something as simple as serving wine properly." A few gasps were heard from nearby tables. Some guests looked away, not wanting to be part of the scene. Others watched with wide eyes, whispering amongst themselves. The restaurant staff stood frozen, unsure if they should intervene. Emma, however, did not react the way most people expected. She didn't cry, she didn't beg for forgiveness, and she didn't tremble in fear. Instead, she simply stood there, holding the bottle with a calm, almost eerie expression. I apologize, sir, she said softly, her tone measured and controlled. But there was something about the way she spoke, something almost unnerving. Richard scoffed, pulling out a handkerchief from his pocket and dabbing at the stain angrily. Pathetic, he muttered. You're just another nobody trying to make a few dollars in tips. People like you should be grateful that people like me even step into places like this. Emma's fingers tightened slightly around the bottle's neck, but her face remained neutral. Behind her, the restaurant manager shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering between Richard and Emma. Clean this up, Richard snapped, motioning to the table. And try not to embarrass yourself again. Emma nodded and quietly turned, heading back toward the counter. But as she walked away, her expression changed just slightly, not of shame or guilt, but something else. Something unreadable. As she disappeared into the back kitchen, the tension in the room remained thick. The guests resumed their conversations, but there was an unmistakable air of unease hanging in the atmosphere. The waitstaff hurriedly cleaned the spilled wine, and Richard's friends made awkward jokes to lighten the mood. Yet, somewhere in the restaurant, someone had been watching Emma carefully, their eyes filled with recognition and surprise. Something about her wasn't ordinary. And Richard Carter had just made a terrible mistake. Emma stepped into the staff area, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as she took a slow, steady breath. The noise of the restaurant still hummed beyond the doors, but she shut it out, focusing on calming herself. The humiliation from Richard's words lingered in the air, yet she wasn't flustered the way he probably expected her to be. If anything, she looked composed. Just then, the restaurant's owner, Mr. Graham, entered the staff area, his face unusually tense. He was a man in his late 50s, well-dressed yet simple, known for his strict but fair management style. Usually, he only addressed employees when necessary, but this time, his approach was different. Emma, he called, his voice surprisingly soft, almost hesitant. She turned to face him, masking her emotions with a polite expression. Yes, sir? Mr. Graham studied her for a moment, his gaze lingering as if trying to piece together something. Then, to everyone's surprise, his tone shifted to one of quiet respect. Come with me, he said, gesturing toward his office. The other staff members exchanged glances. It was unusual for the owner to call a waitress into his office, especially right after an incident like this. Something was off. Emma followed him without question, her face unreadable as always. Inside the office, Mr. Graham shut the door and sighed deeply before turning to her. Are you okay? He asked, his voice laced with something more than just concern. Was it recognition? Emma nodded. I'm fine. He didn't seem convinced. His eyes flickered with unease, and for a long moment, he just stared at her. Then, in a low voice, he said, I know who you are. Emma's posture stiffened ever so slightly. You think no one would notice, Mr. Graham continued, lowering himself into his chair. But I remember faces, Emma. Or should I say, Miss Lancaster? A flicker of something flashed in Emma's eyes, perhaps surprise, perhaps annoyance. But she didn't confirm or deny it. Instead, she simply waited. Mr. Graham exhaled, leaning back. Why are you here? Emma finally spoke, her voice as controlled as ever. Because I need to be. The restaurant owner watched her carefully, trying to read between the lines. He had heard the rumors. He had seen news stories from years ago, buried in business articles and gossip columns, stories about a once powerful family that had suddenly fallen into disgrace. And now, standing before him was someone who shouldn't be here, working as a mere waitress. "You know who Richard Carter is, don't you?" he asked. Emma's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes darkened. Mr. Graham sighed again, rubbing his temple. "Listen, I won't say anything. It's not my business. But if you're planning something, be careful." Emma gave him a small, polite smile. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Graham. But I assure you, I'm just here to do my job." Even though her words were calm, there was an underlying weight to them, something unspoken yet undeniable. Before Mr. Graham could push further, a knock came at the door. "Sir, there's a VIP guest asking for you," a staff member informed. Mr. Graham gave Emma one last look before nodding. "Go on," he said. "And Emma, be careful." She didn't respond as she walked out, closing the door behind her. Back in the dining area, Richard leaned back in his chair, laughing with his friends. "I mean, did you see her face?" he chuckled, swirling his drink. "Like a deer caught in headlights. Serves her right for being careless." His friend smirked. "You think she even knows how much that suit was worth?" "Probably not," Richard scoffed. "People like that, waitresses, workers, they don't understand real value. They're just here to clean up after us." His arrogance was unshaken, his words filled with the entitlement of a man who had never faced consequences. But across the restaurant, someone was watching Emma. A man in a dark gray suit, seated in a quiet corner, barely touching his food. His sharp, observant eyes followed Emma's movements, his gaze unreadable. Unlike the rest of the guests, he wasn't staring at her out of pity or curiosity, his expression was far more calculating. He slowly took a sip of his drink, leaning back, his fingers tapping against the table in thought. Emma, oblivious to his presence, continued working. But if she had looked up, she might have recognized that she was being watched. And not just by anyone. By someone who knew her past. Emma wiped the counter absent-mindedly, her fingers moving in slow circles as she drifted into thoughts she had tried to bury for years. The sounds of the restaurant faded into the background, and for a moment, she was no longer a waitress in a high-end restaurant. She was no longer just Emma. She was Emma Lancaster, heiress to the Lancaster Empire. 5 years ago, the grand halls of the Lancaster Corporation had been her second home. Tall glass windows overlooked the city skyline, polished marble floors reflected the towering walls lined with prestigious awards, and the entire building buzzed with the energy of a multi-million-dollar empire. Emma had grown up surrounded by wealth, luxury, and power. Her father, William Lancaster, was a self-made businessman, a man respected in the industry for his sharp intellect and integrity. He had built his empire from the ground up, turning a small family business into one of the most influential companies in the country. And Emma, his only child, was being groomed to take over. Unlike most billionaire heirs, she wasn't spoiled or entitled. She had been raised to understand business, to value hard work, and to never underestimate an enemy. And yet, that was exactly what they had done. The Lancasters had made one fatal mistake. They had trusted Charles Carter, Richard's father. It started as a business partnership. A joint investment between Lancaster Corporation and Carter Industries that had promised massive profits. On the surface, Charles Carter had seemed like a reliable ally. He had played the role of a supportive partner, even a family friend. But underneath that polished exterior was a ruthless, power-hungry man who had been plotting something far more sinister. One night, everything fell apart. Emma had been in a board meeting when her father received a call. The color drained from his face as he listened, his fingers gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. Moments later, security rushed in. The company's assets were frozen. Their stocks had plummeted overnight. Emma had watched in horror as the reality unfolded. The investment deal had been a trap. Using inside connections, forged documents, and a network of well-placed bribes, Charles Carter had framed William Lancaster for fraud. The media exploded with accusations, and within days, their investors pulled out, their business partners turned their backs, and the once mighty Lancaster empire collapsed into dust. Her father had lost everything. Emma remembered standing outside the courtroom, watching as the press hounded her father, cameras flashing in his face as reporters shouted accusations. "Mr. Lancaster, how do you respond to the charges? Did you really steal millions from investors? Is this the biggest corporate fraud of the decade?" Emma had fought back tears as she clutched her father's hand. They had been set up. She knew it. He knew it. But no one listened. And standing in the shadows, watching the destruction unfold with a satisfied smirk, was Charles Carter. That was the last time Emma saw her father as a free man. He was sentenced to prison, accused of crimes he never committed. Their mansion was seized, their accounts frozen, their assets auctioned off. Overnight, Emma had gone from a billionaire's daughter to a nobody. With nowhere to go and enemies watching her every move, she had done the only thing she could: disappeared. She changed her name. She erased her identity. And she chose a simple life. Back in the present, Emma blinked, snapping back to reality as she placed an empty glass onto a tray. She had buried that life, convinced herself that she had moved on. But tonight, after all these years, she had come face to face with the son of the man who destroyed her family. And he had no idea who she really was. A small, unreadable smile ghosted her lips. Richard Carter had mocked her. Humiliated her. Treated her like she was nothing. But if only he knew. If only he knew who she really was. Richard leaned back in his chair, a smug grin still plastered on his face as he enjoyed his expensive meal. The humiliation he had put Emma through earlier was already forgotten in his mind. To him, she was just another nameless waitress, insignificant and beneath him. But then, the atmosphere shifted. The entrance door swung open, and in walked Margaret Carter, Richard's mother. A woman of grace and poise, always dressed in the finest designer wear, carrying an air of quiet authority. Wherever she went, people noticed. And yet, tonight, something was different. As she stepped inside the restaurant, her eyes fell on Emma. And she froze. For a moment, everything stopped. The noise of the restaurant, the clinking of glasses, the hum of conversation, it all seemed to fade into the background. Margaret's face drained of color. Her perfectly manicured fingers clutched the strap of her handbag a little too tightly. Emma, who had just finished serving another table, met her gaze. There was no shock in her expression. No surprise. No fear. Only calm recognition. Richard, noticing his mother's reaction, frowned in confusion. "Mom?" He waved a hand in front of her face. "Are you okay?" Margaret didn't respond immediately. Her breathing had become uneven. She was still staring at Emma as if she had just seen a ghost. Richard followed her gaze, his brows knitting together. "What? The waitress?" He scoffed. "Yeah, she's clumsy. She spilled wine all over my suit." Margaret's head snapped toward him. "What did you say?" Her voice was sharper than he had ever heard before. Richard blinked, taken aback. "I said she." Before he could finish, Margaret turned back to Emma, her voice softer now. "It's really you, isn't it?" Emma didn't answer right away. Instead, she wiped her hands on a napkin, took a slow step forward, and smiled. "It's been a long time, Mrs. Carter." Richard's eyes widened. Emma's tone wasn't that of a simple waitress addressing a wealthy customer. It was something else. Something familiar. Something dangerous. Margaret swallowed hard, her hands trembling. She knew exactly who Emma was. Emma's presence here wasn't a coincidence. Richard, growing irritated, looked between them. What the hell is going on? Silence stretched between them before Emma finally spoke, her voice carrying an edge of controlled amusement. "You should listen to your mother, Richard. She knows exactly why I'm here." A cold shiver ran down Richard's spine. Emma wasn't begging for an apology. She wasn't intimidated by him. She was warning him. Richard had spent years believing that power belonged to the wealthy, that people like Emma were nothing more than background figures in his life. But for the first time, he felt small. Margaret, still shaken, grabbed his wrist. "Richard, we need to leave. Now." "What?" He pulled his hand away. "Mom, you're overreacting. She's just a—" "I said now." Margaret's voice was sharp, filled with something Richard had never heard before. Fear. The restaurant staff, who had previously ignored Emma's presence, were suddenly watching her differently. Respectfully. Almost cautiously. Something had shifted. Something was very, very wrong. And Richard Carter had no idea what was coming next. The low hum of conversation in the restaurant continued, but an undeniable tension filled the air. Margaret Carter's sudden nervousness, the way the restaurant staff now looked at Emma differently, and the unsettling familiarity in Emma's words, it was all too much for Richard to ignore. He still didn't fully understand what was happening, but he could feel it. Something was off. And then, everything changed. At a nearby table, a man wearing a dark blazer and thin-framed glasses placed his fork down, his eyes narrowing as he watched Emma. He had been sitting there all evening, unnoticed. But now, he recognized her. His name was Daniel Reed, a seasoned journalist always hunting for a story. And tonight, he had found one. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through old articles, his heartbeat picking up as he compared the face in the pictures to the woman standing across the room. There was no mistake. Emma Lancaster. The missing heiress of the Lancaster Empire. The story that had once dominated headlines, the billionaire's daughter who vanished after her father's scandal, the girl who had been at the heart of one of the most shocking corporate downfalls in recent history, was now standing in front of him, wearing a waitress's uniform. Daniel's instincts kicked in. This was huge. Within seconds, he sent out a tweet. "Breaking news, spotted at a high-end restaurant, Emma Lancaster, the billionaire heiress who disappeared years ago. What's she doing working as a waitress? More details coming soon." The tweet spread like wildfire. Within minutes, news outlets picked it up. Journalists started calling the restaurant. Social media erupted. And Richard Carter's world shifted beneath his feet. His phone buzzed on the table. First one notification. Then another. Then dozens. Curious, he picked it up. The words on the screen made his stomach drop. The billionaire heiress working as a waitress? Emma Lancaster spotted. Where has she been all these years? Scandal returns. The daughter of William Lancaster resurfaces. Richard's face went pale. Emma Lancaster? No. That wasn't possible. His hands trembled slightly as he looked up at her, his mind racing. The way she never looked intimidated. The way his mother reacted to her. The way the restaurant owner showed her so much respect. Everything clicked into place. The girl he had mocked, the waitress he had humiliated in front of everyone, wasn't just some nobody. She was a Lancaster, daughter of the man his father had destroyed. His breath caught in his throat. Emma wasn't just here by accident. She knew exactly what she was doing. And she had let him make a fool of himself. Richard swallowed hard, his pride screaming at him to stay composed. He wanted to dismiss it, to pretend this wasn't a big deal. But his mind wouldn't let him. He had insulted a Lancaster in public. And now, everyone knew. Emma, standing across from him, remained completely calm. Unshaken. She watched him with that same unreadable gaze, her eyes filled with something Richard couldn't quite place. Was it amusement? Pity? Or something worse? You? Richard finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. You were a Lancaster? Emma tilted her head slightly, her expression cool and controlled. I still am. His stomach twisted. Everything he thought he knew had been flipped upside down. But his ego wouldn't let him admit it. Even if that's true, he scoffed, forcing out a small laugh, look at you. You're still nothing now. Just a waitress. Emma didn't react the way he expected. She didn't get angry. She didn't look embarrassed. Instead, she simply gave him a small, knowing smile. And yet, here you are, she said softly, shaking. Richard's heart pounded. She was right. Despite his arrogance, despite his wealth, despite everything, she had gotten to him. And for the first time in his life, Richard Carter felt like he wasn't in control. Richard had never felt this kind of unease before. His whole life, he had been the one with power, the one who looked down on people like Emma. But now? Now, he was the one looking up. The air in the restaurant was thick with tension, every pair of eyes locked onto the unfolding scene. The billionaire's son, humiliated. The missing heiress, standing tall. The media outside had already caught wind of the story, and soon, the entire world would know. Richard ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. He needed to fix this. Taking a deep breath, he stepped closer to Emma. His voice, usually laced with arrogance, now held a hint of uncertainty. Emma, listen. I didn't know. I swear, if I had. Emma's gaze was cold, unreadable. If you had known, you would have treated me differently. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. That was exactly what he had meant. Emma's lips pressed into a thin line. So the only reason you regret what you did is because of my name? Richard flinched. She saw right through him. For the first time in his life, he felt small. Before he could respond, another voice cut through the room. You're apologizing? The voice was deep, commanding. Familiar. A slow wave of silence spread through the restaurant. Richard froze. His back stiffened. He knew that voice. And when he turned, his father stood at the entrance. Charles Carter. The man who had taught Richard everything he knew about power, wealth, and control. The man who had built their family's empire. The man who had destroyed Emma's family without a second thought. Charles adjusted his expensive cufflinks as he walked in, his sharp eyes scanning the room. When he saw Emma, he hesitated. But only for a fraction of a second. Then, his usual mask of confidence returned. Emma Lancaster, he said smoothly, stepping forward. It's been a long time. Emma turned slowly to face him. There was no fear in her eyes. No hesitation. Just cold, quiet determination. Charles Carter, she replied, voice steady. I was wondering when you'd show up. Richard glanced between them, suddenly feeling like an outsider in a conversation much bigger than him. Charles smirked. You've made quite the spectacle tonight. Working as a waitress. I have to say, I never expected that. Emma's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. And I never expected you to look so nervous. Charles's smirk faltered just slightly. Emma stepped closer, her voice lowering just enough for only him to hear. What's wrong, Mr. Carter? Afraid people might start asking questions? Afraid the truth might finally come out? Charles's jaw tightened. The truth? He scoffed. The truth is that your father was a fraud. He made mistakes, and he paid the price. Emma's eyes darkened. No, Mr. Carter. You made mistakes. And my father paid the price. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's throat went dry. His father had always told him that the Lancasters had destroyed themselves. That William Lancaster had been careless with his business, that his downfall had been inevitable. But hearing Emma now, seeing the way his father reacted. For the first time, Richard doubted everything he had been told. Emma took another step forward, her voice calm but cutting like a blade. Tell me, Charles, how much did it cost? The lies? The bribes? The silence? Charles's nostrils flared slightly. Do you know what it cost me? Emma's voice was softer now, but there was an edge of steel beneath it. It cost me my home. My family. My father. Richard felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. His father had done this. And suddenly, he couldn't ignore it anymore. Is it true? Richard's voice cracked slightly as he turned to his father. Charles scoffed. What does it matter? It's business, Richard. The strong survive. The weak get crushed. Emma finished for him, her eyes never leaving his. Charles said nothing. Richard felt sick. His father had always taught him to be ruthless, to never let emotions cloud his judgment. But standing here, watching Emma, watching what his family had done to her, he felt something he had never truly felt before. Guilt. Emma studied him for a long moment. Then, quietly, she said, You have a choice, Richard. He looked at her, confused. What? Emma crossed her arms. You can keep pretending that none of this happened. That your father didn't destroy innocent lives. That you're not part of it. Richard swallowed. Or... Emma's eyes gleamed. Or you can do the right thing. Richard hesitated. He could feel his father's gaze burning into him, daring him to defy him. His entire life, he had followed Charles Carter's teachings, had lived by the rules of power and control. But for the first time, he questioned everything. The weight of the choice settled on him. And suspense hung in the air like a storm about to break. The city lights flickered outside the glass walls of the rooftop lounge, casting a golden glow over the skyline. It was late, but Emma knew this meeting was inevitable. Richard stood near the edge, hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had asked to meet her one last time, and against her better judgment, she had agreed. As she approached, Richard turned. His face, usually so full of arrogance and confidence, was different now, haunted, uncertain, vulnerable. Emma, he started, his voice quieter than she had ever heard before. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even deserve it. But I need to say this. She didn't respond. I was wrong, he admitted, forcing himself to meet her gaze. About everything. About you. About my father. About myself. He swallowed hard. I was blind. I let myself believe his lies because it was easier than questioning the truth. Emma remained silent, watching him carefully. I humiliated you, Richard continued, his voice tight. And not just that night at the restaurant. I insulted you without knowing who you were. And even after I found out, I still let my pride get in the way. I was a coward. Emma tilted her head slightly. And now? Richard took a deep breath. Now, I want to make things right. Emma let out a small, humorless chuckle. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Richard hesitated, then pulled out a file from his coat. He placed it on the table between them. Emma glanced down. The file was thick, filled with documents, statements, and reports. I dug into my father's records, Richard explained. I found proof of everything he did to your family. The forged contracts. The bribes. The illegal deals. His jaw clenched. I've sent copies to the press. By morning, the world will know the truth. Emma's fingers tightened around the edge of the file. I know it won't change the past, Richard continued. But at least now, everyone will know what really happened. Emma exhaled slowly. She had waited years for this moment. For the truth. For justice. For vindication. She should have felt triumphant. But something in Richard's eyes made her pause. She studied him carefully, then spoke. I have one more test for you, Richard. His brows furrowed. What do you mean? Emma took a step closer, lowering her voice. Tell the truth, publicly. Not just through documents. Not just through leaks. Face the cameras and say it yourself. Richard stiffened. You want me to? Yes, Emma said firmly. I want you to stand in front of the world and admit everything. Admit that your father was a fraud. Admit that you mocked me without knowing my story. Admit that your family destroyed mine. Richard's breathing grew uneven. He had already betrayed his father by exposing the truth. But standing in front of cameras, publicly admitting his mistakes? That would be the ultimate humiliation. Emma held his gaze. If you really want redemption, Richard, this is the price. The silence stretched between them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Richard gave a single nod. The next morning, the entire world watched as Richard Carter stood before the press. Flashes from cameras flickered across his face, the murmurs of reporters filling the air. Every major news channel was covering it. He took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium. And then, he spoke. My name is Richard Carter, he began, his voice steady but strained. And today, I stand before you not as a billionaire, not as an heir, but as a man who has seen the truth, and can no longer look away. The room fell silent. For years, I believed that my family built their empire on hard work. That my father was a man of integrity. But I was wrong. The gasps were audible. He continued, forcing himself forward. My father, Charles Carter, was responsible for the downfall of Lancaster Industries. He used deception, corruption, and greed to ruin an innocent man, William Lancaster. Emma watched from the back of the room, her arms crossed. Richard's voice wavered, but he didn't stop. I personally played a role in hurting someone who had already lost everything. Emma Lancaster. Her name rang through the room. I insulted her. Humiliated her. Judged her without knowing anything about her. And for that, I am deeply ashamed. He exhaled shakily. I know an apology isn't enough. But this is my first step toward making things right. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled furiously. This was history being made. By the time the press conference ended, the damage was done. Charles Carter's empire crumbled overnight. Investors pulled out. Board members resigned. Lawsuits flooded in. And Emma Lancaster's name was finally cleared. That evening, as Emma stood on the same rooftop where Richard had first asked for her forgiveness, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Richard stood there, hands in his pockets, a changed man. "You did it," she said softly. He exhaled, shaking his head. "You did it." "I just followed through." For a moment, there was only silence between them. The tension that had once defined the relationship was gone, replaced by something quieter, more uncertain. Richard met her gaze. "So, does this mean you forgive me?" Emma studied him carefully. Then, she offered him a small, enigmatic smile. "I think you're asking the wrong question." Richard frowned slightly. "Then what's the right one?" Emma turned to face the city lights, her victory complete. "The right question, Richard, is whether you've finally forgiven yourself." Richard fell silent. Emma didn't wait for an answer. She simply walked away, leaving him with his regrets.